Richard Cavanaugh had it all: wealth, power, and influence. At 45, he was one of the most successful businessmen in Chicago. But despite his achievements, there was a part of his past that haunted him: Evelyn Lancaster. She had been the love of his life, but their marriage ended a decade ago after they learned Evelyn couldn't have children. It was a wound that never fully healed, one he buried under work and success. That evening, Richard attended a high-profile charity gala at the Grand Monarch Hotel. As usual, he was there out of obligation rather than interest. He was making polite conversation with other business leaders when something, or rather someone, caught his attention. At the top of the grand staircase stood Evelyn. She looked stunning, her presence commanding the room in a sleek black dress. But what sent a shock through Richard wasn't just seeing her again. It was the two teenagers standing beside her. A boy and a girl, both blonde, well-dressed, and poised. Richard froze. The resemblance to Evelyn was uncanny. His mind began racing. This can't be right. Evelyn couldn't have children. That fact had shattered their marriage and any dreams they once shared. And yet, here she was, with two young people who appeared to be her children. Evelyn noticed his gaze. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Richard could see a flash of something in her expression. Recognition, perhaps pain, but it quickly vanished. Evelyn broke eye contact, turning away as if he were nothing more than a stranger. Richard felt a knot tighten in his chest. The coldness of that dismissal hit harder than he expected. "Who are those kids?" he muttered under his breath, unable to look away. Questions flooded his mind. Were they her niece and nephew? Adopted? But there was something about the scene that gnawed at him, something that didn't add up. Why did he feel so unsettled? As if he were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. "Mr. Cavanaugh," a voice snapped him out of his thoughts. One of the event organizers was approaching him, but Richard barely registered the man's presence. He gave a distracted nod and turned back toward the staircase. He needed answers. Without a second thought, Richard began walking across the room. The clinking of champagne glasses and hum of conversation faded into the background. His heart pounded in his chest, and a faint sheen of sweat formed on his palms. For a man who prided himself on control, this rush of emotion was foreign and overwhelming. With each step, memories came flooding back. Memories of their last moments together, of Evelyn's tearful goodbye as he walked out of her life. Was everything he believed about their separation a lie? Could there be a truth hidden all these years, one he was never prepared to face? Whatever the answer, Richard knew one thing. He wouldn't rest until he found out. Richard's thoughts spun like a carousel out of control as he made his way up the grand staircase. Evelyn had started to retreat, her pace quick but poised, her two teenage companions flanking her like sentinels. She glided through the crowd with practiced grace, stopping occasionally to nod or exchange pleasantries with the high-profile guests. But Richard could see through the act. She wasn't mingling, she was evading, and that only made him more desperate for answers. "Evelyn," Richard called out when he finally reached the top of the stairs. His voice carried enough weight to stop her in her tracks. For a moment, she remained still, her back to him. Then, as if summoning her composure, she turned slowly to face him. Time seemed to rewind and fast-forward all at once. Richard saw the woman he had once loved, her features unchanged yet altered by the years apart. She was breathtaking, but there was a distance in her eyes now, an icy barrier that hadn't been there before. "Richard," she said finally, her tone cool and distant, as though speaking to an acquaintance from another life. "I didn't expect to see you tonight." "Clearly," Richard responded, though his voice cracked slightly under the pressure of unspoken emotions. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. His eyes flicked to the teenagers standing a few feet away. The boy was studying him with quiet curiosity, while the girl's expression was sharper, more guarded. There was something unsettlingly familiar about their features. He could feel it gnawing at the edges of his mind. "I couldn't help but notice." "Your guests," he said, the question laced with unspoken disbelief. Evelyn glanced at the teens before looking back at Richard. "These are my children," she answered with unsettling calm. Her words struck him like a slap to the face. Children. His heart thudded loudly in his chest as he replayed the sentence in his mind. That couldn't be right. They had ended their marriage because having children wasn't an option. He knew that, he had lived it. Your children, Richard echoed, his voice faltering. He stared at her, waiting for her to correct herself, to laugh and explain that it was all a misunderstanding. But she didn't. Her expression remained unyielding, a silent challenge hanging in the air between them. Yes, she said simply. Lucas is 16, and Claire just turned 15. Evelyn's voice was matter-of-fact, as though she were stating something as ordinary as the time of day. Why don't you two go get some refreshments? She said softly, turning to her children. I'll catch up with you in a bit. The teens hesitated but eventually nodded and walked away. Richard watched them disappear into the crowd, unable to shake the strange, hollow feeling tightening in his chest. As soon as they were out of sight, Richard stepped closer to Evelyn. Evelyn, we both know this isn't possible, he whispered urgently. His eyes bore into hers, searching for any sign of deception. We were told you couldn't. He stopped himself, the weight of the past pressing down on his words. Are they adopted? Evelyn didn't flinch. If anything, her gaze hardened. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm but low, carrying an edge of resentment. You don't get to interrogate me like this, Richard. Not after the way you left. Richard stood frozen for a moment, her words cutting through him like shards of ice. The way you left. The accusation hit harder than he expected, stirring memories he had buried long ago. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself momentarily speechless. The reality of Evelyn standing before him, her children just having walked away, was too much to process. Every instinct told him something wasn't right. He needed answers, but Evelyn's expression was a fortress he couldn't easily breach. Evelyn, this isn't about the past, he finally said, his voice softening just slightly. I'm not here to rehash old wounds, but seeing you tonight, and seeing them, he gestured in the direction her children had gone. You know, that's not something I can just walk away from without asking questions. His eyes narrowed, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. How can you expect me to believe this when… Stop! Evelyn's voice was firm, almost commanding. She crossed her arms, her gaze steady and unwavering. You have no right to question me, Richard. You made your decision a long time ago. You walked away because I wasn't enough, remember? Because I couldn't give you the future you wanted. She exhaled deeply, shaking her head. Now you show up here, and you think you can just demand explanations? Richard flinched at her words, guilt stabbing at his conscience. She wasn't wrong. He had walked away, though at the time, he convinced himself it was for both of their sakes. The grief of knowing they couldn't build a family had consumed him. He had believed Evelyn would eventually thank him for ending the pain before it deepened further. But now, face to face with her after all these years, he realized how deeply that wound had scarred them both. That's not fair, he said quietly, but there was little conviction behind his words. He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly feeling out of place in the opulent surroundings. The room was bustling with laughter and conversation, but in this moment, it felt like they were in a world apart. I didn't want to hurt you, Evelyn. I thought I was doing the right thing back then. The right thing? Evelyn let out a bitter laugh. For who? For yourself. Her eyes glistened momentarily, though she quickly blinked the emotion away. You didn't give me a choice, Richard. You left and didn't look back. So, don't stand here and act like you're entitled to an explanation now. You forfeited that right. Richard took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew he was walking a delicate line. Evelyn had every reason to shut him out, but he wasn't ready to leave without understanding what was happening. Maybe I don't have the right, he admitted, his tone softening even further. But Evelyn, you know this doesn't make sense. We both heard the doctors. What you're telling me. Those kids. How is it possible? He hesitated before asking the next question, fearing how it might come across. Did you find another way? Maybe through surrogacy? Or are they adopted? For a long moment, Evelyn remained silent, her eyes searching his face. It was as though she were weighing whether to answer or to walk away entirely. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and full of warning. "Some truths come with a price, Richard. Are you sure you're ready to pay it?" The tension in the air between them grew thicker, and Richard couldn't shake the feeling that whatever truth she was hiding was far more complicated than he had anticipated. "I just want to understand," he said sincerely, though he could feel the undercurrent of unease building inside him. Evelyn stared at him for a few more moments, then sighed, her expression softening just a fraction. "There's a lot you don't know," she said quietly. "Maybe you never will." With that, she turned and began walking toward the ballroom entrance, leaving Richard standing there in a haze of unanswered questions and rising dread. Richard couldn't shake the weight of Evelyn's parting words. "There's a lot you don't know. Maybe you never will." The phrase echoed relentlessly in his mind as he wandered through the crowded ballroom. The bright lights and chatter felt distant, like white noise blurring into the background. Every nerve in his body was on edge. Evelyn had left him standing with more questions than answers, and he wasn't the kind of man who could leave a mystery unsolved, especially one as personal as this. He spotted Lucas and Claire near the refreshment table. Lucas was laughing softly at something Claire had said, their dynamic easy and natural. Richard couldn't take his eyes off them. The more he studied them, the more unsettling the familiarity became. The boy's strong jawline, the girl's sharp, piercing eyes. There were echoes of Evelyn in both of them, but there was something else too, something hauntingly recognizable. Could it be? No. Richard dismissed the thought as absurd. It wasn't possible, and yet the nagging feeling wouldn't let go. After a moment of hesitation, he approached them. Claire noticed him first. Her expression hardened immediately, her posture stiffening like someone bracing for confrontation. Lucas, however, seemed more curious than hostile, though he remained quiet. Richard stopped a few feet away, sensing the tension. He decided to tread carefully. "Hey," he said with a gentle smile, trying to appear non-threatening. "I'm Richard. I used to know your mother a long time ago." "We know who you are," Claire interrupted coldly, folding her arms across her chest. She told us. There was a defiant edge to her tone, as if she were daring him to explain himself. Lucas shifted uncomfortably but didn't say anything. Richard felt a pang of guilt at the hostility in Claire's voice. He hadn't expected a warm reception, but hearing the resentment in her words stung more than he cared to admit. "Right," he said, his voice calm but tinged with regret. "Look, I'm not here to cause any trouble. I wasn't expecting to see your mom tonight, or the two of you. Caught me off guard. That's all." He hesitated, glancing between them. "You both remind me a lot of her." Claire's eyes narrowed, clearly unimpressed. "Is that supposed to mean something?" she asked. Her tone was sharp, defensive, like someone who had built walls to protect herself. Richard sighed inwardly. He wasn't making any progress with her. Maybe Lucas would be more open. "Claire, give him a break," Lucas finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. He looked at Richard with quiet intensity. "You have questions. I can see it all over your face. But if you're looking for answers, you're not going to get much from us." He glanced at Claire, who rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Richard appreciated the honesty. "I figured as much," he admitted. "But I can't just walk away from this. There's too much that doesn't add up. Your mom and I," he paused, carefully choosing his next words. "We went through a lot together. Finding out about the two of you, it's a lot to take in." Lucas nodded slightly, seeming to understand. Claire, however, remained guarded, her eyes filled with suspicion. "Well, maybe you should have thought about that before you walked out on her," she snapped. The accusation hit Richard like a slap to the face. He didn't have a response, at least not one that would make any difference to them. He could only stand there, grappling with the weight of his choices and the impact they had clearly left behind. Richard lingered near the edge of the ballroom, nursing a glass of scotch he had barely touched. The conversation with Lucas and Claire replayed in his mind over and over. Claire's biting words, "Maybe you should have thought about that before you walked out on her," echoed like a warning shot. He couldn't deny the weight of their anger, nor the truth in it. He had left Evelyn all those years ago, thinking he was sparing them both further pain. But standing here now, surrounded by shadows of the past, he realized how deeply those choices had wounded her, and, apparently, her children. The evening dragged on in a blur of half-hearted greetings and obligatory small talk. Richard couldn't focus on anything. He scanned the room periodically, hoping to catch another glimpse of Evelyn, but she seemed to have disappeared into the crowd. His mind was a tangled mess of confusion and emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. What is she hiding? The question gnawed at him like a persistent ache. Eventually, he decided he couldn't just leave things unresolved. He had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He stepped away from the ballroom, navigating through the opulent corridors of the hotel. His footsteps echoed softly against the marble floors. He wasn't entirely sure where he was going, but instinct guided him forward. As he rounded a corner, he saw her standing by a balcony, gazing out at the city lights below. She looked deep in thought, her posture tense. "Evelyn," he called out softly. She didn't flinch but turned her head slightly, acknowledging his presence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Finally, Richard approached, stopping a few feet away from her. "I couldn't leave without talking to you," he said quietly. "Not after everything that's happened tonight." Evelyn sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "What do you want from me, Richard?" she asked, her voice tired but not entirely unkind. "Haven't we already said everything that needed to be said years ago?" "Maybe we thought we had," he replied. "But I didn't know about them, Lucas and Claire. You can't just expect me to walk away after seeing them. You have to understand how that feels." Her eyes darkened, and she shook her head slowly. "No, Richard, you don't understand how it feels. You didn't stay to live with the aftermath. You didn't see what it did to me, what I had to go through alone." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "And now you show up here, demanding answers like you have some right to them." "I'm not demanding anything," he said gently. "I'm just trying to make sense of it all. We were told it wasn't possible. I didn't think I'd ever see you with children, Evelyn. But here you are with two teenagers who look just like you. How am I supposed to process that?" Evelyn turned fully toward him now, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she simply studied him, as though weighing whether he deserved the truth or if it was better to keep him in the dark. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but firm. "There's a reason you weren't meant to know, Richard. Some truths are better left buried." The cryptic response sent a shiver down his spine. Every word out of her mouth only deepened the mystery. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Maybe for you, but I can't leave this alone, Evelyn. I need to know. Were they adopted? Did something change after we parted ways?" He hesitated, the next words catching in his throat. "Or, is there more to this than I ever realized?" She met his gaze head-on, the intensity in her eyes almost unbearable. "You're not ready for the truth," she whispered. "And once you learn it, there's no going back." With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway, leaving Richard drowning in a sea of uncertainty and a growing fear of what he might uncover next. Richard stood motionless for a long time after Evelyn left, her words looping endlessly in his mind. "You're not ready for the truth. And once you learn it, there's no going back." His instincts, honed by years in business, screamed that there was more to the story. Evelyn had built a life without him, a life that didn't fit the narrative he thought he knew. And those two teenagers, their presence gnawed at him, demanding answers. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before Patrick Morris, his dependable assistant, picked up. "Mr. Cavanaugh, how can I help you?" "Patrick, I need you to run a background check on Evelyn Lancaster. I want every detail, where she's been living, family, everything. But keep it under the radar," Richard said, keeping his voice low. "Understood," Patrick replied immediately. Ending the call, Richard stared out over the glittering Chicago skyline, his mind racing. He hated involving others in something so personal, but Evelyn had given him no choice. She was guarding a secret, and he couldn't leave without understanding what it was. He let out a deep breath, memories from their marriage clawing their way to the surface. He remembered the day the doctors shattered their hopes. The diagnosis had been cold and definitive, no possibility of children. Evelyn had been crushed, and Richard didn't know how to handle the weight of their shared grief. In time, he convinced himself that leaving was the right decision. Now, standing in the present, he wondered if he'd been blind to a truth she'd carried all these years. Footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Turning, he saw Lucas approaching. The teenager moved with quiet confidence, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. Richard straightened, unsure what to expect. "You don't need to dig around," Lucas said, his voice calm but assertive. "I know you've already called someone, but you're wasting your time. Mom won't tell you anything. Neither will I." Richard was momentarily taken aback but decided not to deny it. "You care about your mom. I respect that," he replied, watching Lucas closely. "But I'm not here to hurt anyone. I just need to know the truth." Lucas studied him, his gaze steady and serious. "You already hurt her," he said quietly. "She doesn't talk about it much, but I know you did. Whatever truth you're chasing, it's not going to change that." Without waiting for a response, Lucas turned and walked away, leaving Richard alone with the weight of regret and the ominous feeling that whatever he was about to uncover might not be what he wanted to hear. The next morning, Richard awoke in his penthouse apartment with a lingering sense of dread. He hadn't slept much, his mind trapped in a cycle of unanswered questions. Evelyn's warning and Lucas's words had both struck deep, but neither had brought him any closer to the truth. As he sipped his black coffee and stared out at the sprawling city below, his phone buzzed on the counter. It was Patrick. "Got some information," Patrick said without preamble. Evelyn moved back to Chicago 7 years ago. She's been working with various charities, but here's where things get interesting. There are no records of adoption for Lucas and Claire. Legally, they're listed as her biological children. Richard froze, gripping the phone tighter. "Biological? That's not possible." "I double-checked everything," Patrick confirmed. "Birth certificates, medical records, it all lines up. The kids were born just a couple of years after you and Evelyn separated." Richard leaned against the counter, his mind spinning. If the records were accurate, it meant one of two things. Either the diagnosis they received years ago had been wrong, or Evelyn had kept something monumental from him. Both possibilities left him reeling. He needed to confront her directly, but he also knew she'd likely refuse to talk to him unless he forced the issue. "Thanks, Patrick. Keep this between us," Richard muttered before hanging up. Later that afternoon, he found himself in front of a sleek brownstone on the city's north side. It was Evelyn's home. The air was crisp and cool, and for a moment, Richard hesitated, unsure if he was ready for the confrontation that awaited inside. He hadn't felt this uncertain in years. Taking a deep breath, he walked up the stone steps and rang the doorbell. Moments later, the door opened, and Claire stood there, her expression a mix of annoyance and suspicion. "What are you doing here?" she asked bluntly, folding her arms across her chest. "I need to speak with your mother," Richard replied, keeping his tone calm. He could see the defiance in her eyes, but there was also a flicker of curiosity. After a tense pause, she stepped aside, allowing him in. The warmth of the house enveloped him, but it did little to ease the tension between them. As Claire closed the door behind him, he heard footsteps approaching from another room. "Richard," Evelyn's voice echoed softly in the entryway, carrying both surprise and weariness. When she appeared, her face hardened slightly. "What are you doing here?" "I couldn't stay away," he said quietly, meeting her gaze. "We need to talk. No more secrets, Evelyn. I know what the records say." Evelyn stood still in the doorway, her expression hardening as Richard's words sank in. "So, you've been digging into my life," she said softly, but there was a sharpness in her tone. "I should have expected that. You always needed to control everything, didn't you?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she crossed her arms. Richard held her gaze, unflinching. I didn't have a choice, he replied. You weren't going to tell me anything. I saw the records, Evelyn. Lucas and Claire are listed as your biological children. How can that be true? We both know what the doctor said. There was no chance. He stepped forward, his voice calm but full of tension. I need to understand. Evelyn let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. You need to understand? You? Her voice grew harder. You walked out on me, Richard. The moment things didn't go as planned, you left. Now you think you can just show up after all this time and demand answers like you're entitled to them. Richard inhaled deeply, steadying himself. I made mistakes, he admitted quietly, his eyes softening. I thought I was doing the right thing by leaving. I believed it would hurt less if we ended things early. But I was wrong. Seeing those kids tonight, Evelyn, I can't just walk away from this. I need to know the truth. Were the doctors wrong? Did something change after I left? Evelyn sighed heavily and lowered her gaze. No, she said after a long pause. The diagnosis wasn't wrong. I couldn't have children naturally. That was real. She rubbed her hands together slowly, as though the memory weighed heavily on her. For a moment, Richard thought she might not say anything more. Then she continued, her voice distant. But after you left, something else happened. Something I didn't expect. Richard leaned in, his pulse quickening. What happened? He asked gently but urgently. His mind raced through the possibilities. Was it surrogacy? Adoption? Something else entirely? Without answering immediately, Evelyn turned and started walking toward the living room. We're not doing this at the front door, she said over her shoulder. Richard hesitated, then followed her. The room was warm and inviting, filled with subtle but elegant touches of her style. His eyes drifted to a set of framed photos on a wooden shelf. One picture, in particular, caught his attention. A shot of Evelyn on a beach with Lucas and Claire. The three of them were laughing, their faces radiant with joy. It was a moment of pure happiness he had never been a part of. The sight twisted something deep inside him. Evelyn sat down on the couch and gestured for him to take a seat across from her. Silence hung between them for several moments, thick and unyielding. Finally, Evelyn exhaled slowly and spoke again. A few months after you left, I was approached by a fertility specialist, she explained, her tone more subdued. They were working on an experimental treatment. It wasn't a guarantee, but it gave me a small chance. And at that point, I had nothing left to lose. She paused, her eyes clouded with old memories. Against all odds, the treatment worked. I got pregnant. Twice. Richard stared at her, the words echoing in his mind as he struggled to grasp their weight. You never told me, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Why? Her gaze hardened slightly. Why? You were already gone, Richard, she replied, her tone sharp but not without sadness. You made your decision. I wasn't going to call you back out of pity. By the time I found out I was pregnant, I'd learned how to live without you. Richard sat in stunned silence, Evelyn's words reverberating in his mind. I got pregnant. Twice. The room seemed to shrink around him, and for a moment, he struggled to comprehend the enormity of what she had just revealed. All those years he had spent convinced that their dreams of a family had been permanently destroyed, shattered by medical certainty, were now being rewritten by this shocking truth. You're telling me the impossible happened? He finally managed, his voice hoarse. The doctors said there was no chance. No treatments. No options. How could this happen? He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his mind racing for an explanation that made sense. Evelyn gave a slow nod, her eyes fixed on a spot on the floor as if replaying painful memories. It wasn't a miracle, Richard, she replied softly. It was science. A fertility specialist reached out to me a few months after you left. They were working on something experimental, still in the early stages. I was skeptical, but I had nothing to lose. You were gone, and I was broken. Her voice caught for a moment, and she exhaled shakily before continuing. I took the risk. It wasn't easy, but somehow it worked. Richard felt a pang of guilt deep in his chest as he listened. Why didn't you tell me? He asked quietly. Even after it worked, After you knew you were pregnant, you didn't think I had the right to know? She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. You made it very clear when you walked away that you wanted no part of that life anymore. I wasn't going to call you out of some sense of obligation or hope that you'd come running back. I had to learn how to live without you. I had to protect myself. And them. Richard swallowed hard. He couldn't deny that his departure had sent a clear message, one he now regretted more than ever. Still, the idea of missing the birth and upbringing of 2 children, a family he never knew he had, left him feeling hollow. He struggled to process the fact that the life they had dreamed of had existed after all, but without him. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you, Evelyn, he said after a long pause. His voice was low but steady. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was sparing us both more pain. I thought we were at a dead end. He glanced toward the photo of Evelyn and the kids on the mantel, his heart aching. I was wrong. I see that now, but I can't change the past. I just want to know where we go from here. Evelyn's gaze softened, though there was still a guardedness in her expression. Where we go from here? I don't know, Richard, she admitted. Lucas and Claire don't know you. They've built a life without you. I'm not going to force them into some perfect little reunion just because you've shown up after all this time. She paused, her eyes locking onto his. But maybe there's a chance for something. That depends on you, and on them. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He knew that rebuilding trust and a relationship with the children he never knew would be a long, uncertain journey. But for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. Hope that he could finally mend the wounds of the past and be part of the life he had lost. Richard arrived at the park where Evelyn had told him to meet Lucas and Claire. The crisp afternoon air carried the faint scent of pine and distant laughter from a group of children playing near the swings. He stood by a large oak tree, hands stuffed in his coat pockets, nerves twisting in his stomach. It had been a long time since he had felt this kind of anxiety, the fear of not being accepted. He reminded himself that this wasn't a business deal or a negotiation. This was about his children, and there were no guarantees here. Lucas was the first to arrive, walking calmly across the park path. He wore a light jacket and had a thoughtful expression on his face. Behind him, Claire followed at a slower pace, her arms crossed defensively. She didn't look pleased to be here, but at least she had come. Richard forced himself to relax as they approached. "Hey," Lucas said casually, stopping a few feet in front of Richard. "Mom said you wanted to talk to us." His tone was neutral, neither cold nor overly friendly. Claire, on the other hand, kept her gaze sharp and distrustful. "Yeah," Richard responded, clearing his throat. "I did. I wanted to see both of you. To explain things, if you'll let me." He hesitated, glancing between them. "I know I've been a stranger to you, and that's on me. But if you give me a chance, I want to change that." Claire scoffed softly, shaking her head. "You really think you can just walk into our lives after all this time and everything's going to be fine?" she said, her voice laced with skepticism. "That's not how it works." "I don't expect that," Richard replied gently. "I know it'll take time. I know you both have every reason to be angry with me. I didn't know you existed, and I wasn't there for you when I should have been. I can't change the past. But I want to be here now." He turned his attention to Claire specifically. "I'm not asking for forgiveness overnight. Just a chance." Lucas gave Claire a sideways glance before speaking again. "You really didn't know about us?" he asked quietly. "No," Richard answered firmly. "I didn't. Your mother and I had been told it wasn't possible for us to have children. After I left, I thought that chapter of my life was closed forever. But when I found out about you, it changed everything." His voice softened. "I'm not perfect, Lucas. I've made mistakes. But I want to be honest with both of you moving forward." Claire stared at him for a long moment before finally relaxing her stance, though her eyes remained guarded. Lucas nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "We'll see how this goes. But don't expect us to make this easy." Richard smiled faintly, feeling the first shred of hope take root. "I wouldn't expect anything less," he replied. For the first time in a decade, He felt as though he was beginning to mend the shattered pieces of his life. It wouldn't be easy, but it was a start, and for now that was enough.